They call brave at the same time, and in that instant, with the fluorescent light buzzing over our heads and the smell of printer toner and takeout noodles floating up from the lobby, my son turned me into a punchline he could toss like a paper cup into a bin. That's floor, but the hunger in people who need to feel taller by grinding someone else down to the tile. I am 74, and I clean at night not because I must prove something to anyone, but because moving a broom across a wide corridor and seeing the line between dust and order appear under the bristles is the kind of truth my body understands, the kind you can hold in your hands and smell in the water when the bucket turns gray. And if I say I live alone, it is only to set the scene, not to ask. For pit need to remember that time, like soap, loosens what clings until it lets go. I wasn't always a janitor. For 23 years, I balanced ledgers for a hardware distributor, where the owner felt important because he had a parking space with his name stenciled in white. But every quarter, when the auditors came, I was the one who made the columns behave. And I suppose that is why the first time I picked up a squeegee, it felt less like a demotion than a translation. Numbers to surfaces, audits to shine, accountability still accountability. And maybe this is what my son never learned while he was chasing titles that look handsome on a glass door. That labor wears many uniforms, and the only real prestige arrives when you finish and no one has to come behind you to do the job again. I tell him in the English he thought tasted like money, and I forgave him because boys in rough neighborhoods get their armor where they can find it. But armor becomes a habit, and a habit becomes a costume. And then one morning, the costume convinces the man inside that his skin is silk and everyone else's is burlap, which is how you end up with a grown son who curates his mother instead of seeing her. I am not saying I was perfect. I worked 2 jobs after his father died and missed too many school nights when the socks needed folding and the sink would not empty itself. And I taught him the wrong lesson, which is that love is a list you check off. After you close the store, that affection can be substituted by receipts. That presence is a luxury you purchase, with sacrifice later. Later is a dangerous word. It blooms like mold in the corners of a life. It eats the paint first, and then the plaster, and then the studs. And by the time you notice, a wall is a memory. The night he mocked me was a Friday, the kind that slips like a coin through the slot of the week and disappears. And I had finished wiping down the handprints from the glass doors because fingerprints are complaints in a language I can read, when I heard the laugh that men use when they're gathered like birds on a wire, cheerful and sharp. And I recognized Evan's consonants before his vowels. He has always cut his words like meat. No time wasted on sauce. And I thought, let him be. He is young. Inside the suit, even if the suit keeps lying to him about his age. I did not approach. I am the after-hours ghost. I live in the margins of their productivity. I arrive when their ambition has gone home to stream a show, and their teeth are in a glass by the sink. And I am proud of this invisibility because invisibility is an honest trade when you choose it yourself, but invisibility imposed feels like theft. And that is what cracked in me when he made me the garnish to his story, the cute detail that proves he came from nothing and therefore deserves everything. I wanted to say, hee-ho. I did not come from nothing, and neither did you. We came from women whose hands learned to be steady because the world around them shook like a bus window. And there is a difference between shining and being seen. After they stepped into the elevator, after the doors closed with that sigh that always sounds to me like a tired mother settling a baby who will not sleep, I rolled my cart to the stairwell and took the stairs because I do not like being carried. when my legs can still remember how the ground was given to us. And as I walked down level by level, I thought of the times I pretended not to hear him practicing superiority at home. The little drills, the small derisions that children rehearse, and how I chose to save my breath the way I saved my tips, tight and hidden, because there were bills and there was fatigue, and there was the superstition that kindness offered at the wrong moment can make a boy weak in a world that punishes softness. First, and how I was wrong, because what I taught him by silence was not survival, but permission. I live now with fewer things and more rituals. I hang my apron at the back of the bathroom door. I lay out my shoes on a newspaper so the soles can dry without warping. I fold my gloves with the fingers aligned because a tool that waits respectfully serves better when you reach for it in the dark. And I take my dinner late, a bowl of lentils with onions and a slice of bread. And I eat slowly because hunger is faster than digestion. And there is no prize for finishing before sleep. And when the kettle whistles, I let it sing a little longer than necessary, as if the apartment were applauding. And in these ordinary ceremonies, my muscles forgive the day for what the day did not know it was doing. Do not imagine that I am lonely. Loneliness is a shape, sometimes wide, sometimes narrow, but it is not always empty. And in mine, there are souvenirs of women I worked beside who kept the city from collapsing into its own neglect. Maria, who could look at a spill and tell what caused it, the way a detective reads a scuff on a door, and Aisha, who wrapped her knee with an old scarf and refused to limp in front of the men who dropped their coffee cups and also their eyes, and June, who said, "If you want the truth about a place, ask the person who cleans it, because anyone can tidy what is seen. But trust is what you find under the rug." These are my saints, and when I wring a mop, I think of their wrists and their stubborn grace. And I am accompanied. So when I tell you I did not cry after the elevator, believe me that I have already wept my allotment of foolish tears in other decades, and what came instead was the even breath of a swimmer who knows the distance to the far wall. I walked to the custodial closet. I set my bucket on the lip of the sink. I watched the swirl of dirty water circle the drain like a small planet, remembering its orbit. And I understood that a person can be humiliated only if she has agreed that another person's opinion is a mirror. And there, with my keys jangling against my hip and the hallway's motion sensor blinking awake because even the building wanted to witness, I made a quiet promise to stop borrowing my reflection from anyone who had never held a sponge. If you need a paperback tucked into the drawer, and smiled at me with the particular kindness of those who work when others dream. And the plant near the entrance had the dusty leaves of a neglected hope. And I touched each leaf with a cloth and felt ridiculous tenderness. And in touching it, I understood my own stubbornness, which looks like humility to strangers. And perhaps that is the last thing to know about me before we go further. I am not meek. I am contained. I am not sad. I am measuring. I am not a martyr. I am a woman who has learned to rename things so I can carry them without breaking my back. And if my son prefers applause to truth, then he will have to learn, as all performers do, that the lights go down, the stage is swept, the seats are folded up, and the person who closes the door behind everyone else holds the keys. The day it became undeniable wasn't marked by a fight or an outburst or some catastrophic mistake on my part. It wasn't dramatic. That's what made it so cruel. the sheer ordinariness of it. It was a Thursday, bland as oatmeal. I'd spent the morning in the recreation room watching a documentary about national parks with a few other residents, none of whom spoke much. I didn't mind the silence. I'd learned to live alongside it the way you live alongside a creek, always there, but just out of reach. After lunch, I returned to my room and found the envelope. It was small, white, unassuming. No return address. It stated in polite bureaucratic language that as of that week, all personal banking notifications would be redirected to my daughter's address. The phrase used was "for administrative convenience." That phrase, 4 words, was what cracked something in me. Not the logistics, not the policy, but the tone. Administrative convenience. As if I were a task to be managed. As if the rhythms of my life, bills, statements, small acts of autonomy, were just clutter to be streamlined. I called the front desk. The young woman who answered had a soft, tired voice and seemed surprised I was even aware. "Oh, yes," she said, flipping through something. "That was updated by your next of kin. It's standard when the family assumes responsibility for care." Assumes responsibility? It sounded noble, didn't it? But what it meant was control. What it meant was that I wasn't trusted to navigate my own affairs. What it meant was that I had been quietly, efficiently, legally erased. That night, I sat in my room and stared at the curtain rod above the window, watching the shadows move across the plaster wall as the security light from the parking lot shifted with the wind. I couldn't sleep. I didn't even try. Around midnight, I took out the old notebook I'd been hiding behind a false panel in the dresser drawer, the one I used to jot down thoughts, memories, scraps of things I didn't want to lose. And on a fresh page, I wrote, "Today, they stole my name." That's what it felt like. Not a theft of money or time or even dignity, a theft of selfhood. My bank was mine. My mail was mine. My life, whatever scraps remained of it, was mine. And now it was a shared asset, a case file, a box checked on someone else's to-do list. I was no longer a person. I was a point of liability. 2 days later, I received another envelope. This one was from a lawyer, my daughter's. Inside was a copy of a proposed power of attorney agreement, already filled out, with my name typed neatly in the signature field. All I had to do was sign, no pressure, no explanation. Just a note attached in my daughter's handwriting. "Mom, this will make things easier for everyone." Easier. That word again. Not kinder, not safer, just easier. I folded the paper carefully and slid it back into the envelope without touching a pen. At lunch that day, Eunice, the woman who always muttered about her lost ring, looked up at me suddenly and said, "You're leaving soon." It wasn't a question. I didn't answer. I just smiled and reached for her napkin when she dropped it, but something in me nodded. Yes, I was. Not because I had a plan. Not yet. But because I could no longer stay. That night, I lay in bed and remembered the last real conversation I'd had with my daughter. It had been over a year earlier, before the fall, before the quiet reassignment of my life. She'd called me at 10 o'clock on a Tuesday to ask if I could watch the kids on Saturday because their usual sitter had canceled. I said yes. Of course I did. She didn't ask how I was, or if I was free, or if I had other plans. Just, "Can you take the kids?" And I did. I always did. I made lasagna and cleaned up their mess and pretended not to notice when the older one rolled her eyes at me. That was the last time I felt needed. Not wanted, not loved, just used in a way that still had purpose. Now, they didn't even need me for that. Now, I was a risk, a complication, a cost center. I could feel the edges of myself starting to fray in that place. Every day was a copy of the one before. Wake up, medication, breakfast. Wait, wait, wait. A brief shuffle to the lounge, a tepid tray of lunch, a bingo sheet with missing numbers. Dinner, news no one listened to. Lights out. Repeat. The staff were kind enough, but kindness without intimacy is a cold blanket. They called me Mrs. Harlow, as if formality were a kindness, as if my first name had been archived for safekeeping. No one asked about my garden. No one remembered I used to teach. No one mentioned the poems I once wrote or the volunteer hours I gave to the shelter down on 8th and Monroe. I was reduced to a set of stats: age, blood pressure, allergy status. I became the quiet one in room 214 with the stubborn blood sugar and the good insurance. Then came the day I asked to see the director. I said I wanted to review my records, understand my status. She looked puzzled, even concerned. "Are you unhappy here?" she asked. I said I wasn't anything here. That's what scared me most. She offered to call my daughter. I declined. Instead, I asked for a printout of my billing records. She hesitated, but eventually obliged. What I saw made my stomach tighten. Charges for services I hadn't used, a recurring payment to an account listed under my daughter's LLC. I stared at the line item for private transportation services, even though I hadn't left the facility in 3 months. I said nothing to the director, just nodded and said, "Thank you." But I walked back to my room differently. Slower, yes, but with a clarity that felt almost electric. That night I made my decision. It was not born of anger, though I had plenty. It was not born of fear, though I was afraid. It was born of something older, something bone deep. The same thing that made me leave home at 17. The same thing that carried me through my husband's cancer. The same thing that taught me how to survive on a nurse's salary with 2 children and 1 broken car. I didn't have a name for it then. I still don't. But I know what it feels like. It feels like remembering yourself. Like hearing your own voice after years of silence and thinking, "Oh, there you are." I wasn't running away. I was reclaiming something that should never have been given away in the first place. The right to be a person. A full, flawed, living woman. Not a file. Not a patient. Not a burden passed between inboxes. The next morning, I tucked the lawyer's envelope under my mattress, where I'd hidden the $200 I'd been saving for emergencies. I considered this one, and so too, that was the day I knew. I was no longer invited to my own life. I had been left behind long before I ever stood up to leave, and I wasn't going to wait for a better moment. The moment was already here. I returned to the building the following week with the same steady steps, yet something invisible had changed inside me, a quiet rearrangement of purpose that I could feel in my chest like the slow turning of a lock. It was not revenge, not even defiance exactly, but a kind of clear, grounded curiosity, the kind that comes after long humiliation, when you finally stop wondering what you did wrong and start observing how others justify what they do. I began to notice small things. The missing entries in the maintenance logs, the inflated orders for supplies that never arrived, the signatures that looked photocopied instead of written by hand. And because I had once spent years reading balance, sheets and invoices. The patterns revealed themselves like stains under bright light. It wasn't difficult work, it was simple arithmetic. But what made it remarkable was that no one else had seen it, or perhaps no one else had cared to. The building was managed by people who believed oversight was a synonym for leadership, people who equated data with truth and forgot that numbers are only as honest as the hands that write them. I saw those hands everywhere, smudged on the corners of reports, echoing through the careless margins of someone else's efficiency, and I started keeping my own notes, not because I wanted to expose anyone, but because I could not stand disorder. Disguised as success. Each night, I moved through the offices like a ghost accountant, making columns in my small notebook between the lists of cleaning supplies. I still polished the chrome, emptied the bins, replaced the paper towels, but my eyes were working elsewhere, reading the quiet language of dysfunction. The work gave me a strange sense of calm. There is something comforting in precision, in knowing that while you cannot fix the world, you can at least align the edges of a desk and feel for a moment that something is in its right place. I thought often of my son during those hours, of how proud he looked in the corporate photos framed along the hallway, his jaw set just so, the expensive watch peeking from his cuff. I wondered if he ever thought about how many hands, unseen and underpaid, kept the floors beneath that watch shining. I doubted it. Pride is a blindness that polishes itself daily until even truth slides off its surface. One evening, when I was finishing the top floor, I met the new operations director, a woman named Patel, mid-40s, brisk, unsentimental, with eyes that missed nothing. She had stayed late and caught me in the hallway, crouched near the vending machine, taking note of the broken dispenser that had been listed as replaced on last month's report. She asked what I was doing, not suspicious, only curious. I told her quietly that the replacement order seemed odd since the model number didn't match the one actually installed. She tilted her head, surprised that a cleaner knew what a model number was. "I used to do accounting," I said, and something softened in her expression, that brief flash of recognition when one worker sees another through the disguise of uniform and class. She asked me a few more questions, about supply deliveries, about the maintenance crew that came on weekends, and I answered simply, no embellishment, just what I had seen. When she thanked me and walked away, I felt a strange flutter of something that hadn't visited me in years. Not pride exactly, but validation. It was like hearing your own name spoken in a language you thought you had forgotten. After that night, the pattern of my days changed subtly. I began to be assigned more specific tasks, inventory checks, log verification, building access audits, all presented as favors, as if I were helping the administrative team lighten their load. I didn't mind. I liked the quiet logic of it. I came to understand that the company had been bleeding money through its maintenance contracts for months, and while I didn't yet know who was responsible, I suspected that negligence had built itself into the system like mold behind a wall. Every discovery felt like both a wound and a healing, a reminder that my skills, though dismissed, were not obsolete. I could still read truth where others saw only numbers. Meanwhile, Evan grew more distant, though we worked under the same roof. I saw him sometimes, crossing the lobby or hurrying through the parking lot, phone pressed to his ear, eyes forward as if the air itself were an obstacle. He never saw me, or if he did, he trained his gaze just past my shoulder. That subtle art of pretending you are alone when you know you are being watched. It used to hurt. Now it only confirmed what I already knew, that some people are so determined to escape their origins that they confuse invisibility with freedom. Still, I watched him from afar, the way one observes a building's cracks to see if they widen, because a mother's habit of vigilance never truly ends. Weeks passed like that, a routine of order and quiet discovery, until the first real sign of escalation appeared in an email accidentally printed on the wrong machine. It was addressed to Evan from the procurement department, discussing discrepancies in vendor billing and the upcoming audit that could raise uncomfortable questions. My breath caught as I realized the sums they mentioned aligned perfectly with the overcharges I had been tracking. For a long moment, I stared at his name on the page, at the initials after it that he wore like medals, and I felt a wave of exhaustion more than anger. I had imagined many forms of betrayal, but not this, the careless kind that risks everything not for greed, but for pride, the illusion of competence. That night, I stayed late, sitting on a low stool in the storage room surrounded by boxes of cleaning supplies and fluorescent bulbs, the hum of the building settling into its nocturnal rhythm. I thought of the years I had spent teaching him honesty not through sermons, but through example, balancing every household bill, returning overpayments, refusing to cut corners even when we couldn't afford the long way, and how those lessons had dissolved somewhere between his first promotion and his first glass office. I thought of how betrayal changes shape with age. When you are young, it is a sharp cut. Later, it becomes a slow suffocation. But even then, I couldn't bring myself to hate him. Hate is easy and quick, and I have learned that quick feelings burn out before dawn. Instead, I felt something older, steadier, a resolve to let truth walk its own path, even if it walked right through his nameplate. The next evening, Ms. Patel approached me again, this time with a folder in her hands. She asked if I could help cross-check the maintenance invoices for the past quarter, said she trusted my eye for inconsistencies. I hesitated, not wanting to step further into a world that wasn't mine anymore. But she smiled in that knowing way that tells you she's already decided. "You don't have to sign anything," she said. "Just look." So I looked. And in looking, I found patterns so familiar they might as well have been fingerprints. Repeated vendor codes, recycled authorization numbers, even cut-and-paste digital signatures. I knew what it meant. Fraud rarely announces itself with sirens. It whispers through repetition. For several nights after that, I worked later than usual, making sure no one saw me studying the records. I wasn't afraid of discovery. I was afraid of misunderstanding. By the time the internal audit began, I had already given Ms. Patel everything she needed to see the shape of the truth without my name attached to it. When the storm finally arrived, it came quietly. A Monday morning, gray and ordinary. I was mopping the lobby when I saw Evan and Ms. Patel walk into the glass conference room. Through the reflection, I caught only fragments, papers sliding across the table, her calm gestures, his stiff nods, the flush creeping up his neck. When the meeting ended, he came out alone, eyes vacant, tie loosened. He didn't see me standing by the vending machine. He looked smaller than I remembered, not in stature, but in certainty. It's a strange thing to witness your child being humbled not by punishment, but by consequence. There was no triumph in it, only an aching clarity. That evening, as I rode the bus home, the city lights smudged against the window like melted stars. I realized that something irreversible had shifted between us. I had not betrayed him. He had betrayed his own values, and all I had done was refuse to sweep it under the rug. The silence between us now felt clean in its own way, like a floor newly washed, waiting to dry. I knew he would call eventually, that there would be apologies shaped like explanations, and I knew I would listen without resentment. But deep down, I also knew that the real conversation had already happened, wordlessly, in the reflection of that glass conference room where a mother finally stopped carrying her son's illusions for him. When they finally called me into the office, I expected the usual tone people use with cleaners when they need to sound official. Slow, over-explained, like giving directions to someone lost. But Ms. Patel greeted me differently. She offered me a chair across from her desk and 2 cups of tea already poured, as if she had anticipated my refusal to accept kindness on command. The air in her office smelled faintly of cardamom and paper, and the blinds were half closed against the bright winter light. She began with a sentence I will never forget because of how ordinary it sounded. "You see things others miss." For a second, I thought she meant the dust on her shelves or the smudge on her glass door, so I smiled politely, unsure what to say. Then she slid a folder toward me, the same one I had quietly helped her fill with invoices and mismatched signatures, and said, "Your notes clarified everything. The discrepancies were confirmed. It's going to the board next week." I kept my hands in my lap because they were trembling, not from fear, but from the sudden, dizzying awareness that my small acts of attention had grown into something with weight. She told me I would not be named in any report, that the company would handle it internally, but she wanted to thank me personally. "Sometimes," she said, "honesty comes from the least expected direction." I wanted to tell her it shouldn't be unexpected, that the floor and the truth should be cleaned with the same care, but the words stayed in my throat. Instead, I nodded and said, "Thank you for noticing." When I walked out of that office, the hallway looked different. Not brighter, not grander, but clearer, as though the air had been polished. I had not realized how long I'd been holding my breath in that building, how every shift had been a small act of endurance. Now, the air felt breathable again. I carried the mop bucket that evening as if it were lighter than before, though the weight had not changed. Sometimes justice does not roar, it exhales. Over the following days, I sensed the tremor of change moving through the building. Conversations stopped when I entered a room. The usual laughter in the break area thinned to whispers. Rumors travel faster than facts, but the shape of truth has a way of revealing itself even when unnamed. I saw Evan once, crossing the hallway with his tie askew, the shine gone from his face, his phone gripped like a lifeline. Our eyes met for the briefest moment. He looked at me not with anger, but with something worse, bewilderment, the expression of a man realizing that the story he's told himself is no longer convincing. I didn't speak. Neither did he. It was too soon for words, too late for explanations. That week, Ms. Patel called again, not for cleaning, but for counsel. "You have experience," she said. "We need someone to review our operations procedures from the ground level. No one knows this building better than you." I thought she was joking, but she was serious. They wanted a temporary position, consultant they called it, a tidy word for what I had done my entire life without a title. Keeping things honest, functional, alive. I hesitated. The offer felt heavy with irony. To be paid for what I had done quietly for decades, unacknowledged, seemed almost indecent, like turning air into currency. But then I thought of how many times I had folded myself small to make others comfortable, how many rooms I had entered like a shadow, so that others could glow. I decided to accept. They gave me a small badge with a new label, Facilities Advisor, and access to the same digital system where my son's name still appeared, though his title now had the fragile parentheses of interim reassignment. I didn't ask what that meant. I didn't need to. I learned to navigate the software, to trace the arteries of the company from the perspective of its maintenance rather than its ambition. The deeper I looked, the more I saw how chaos hides behind efficiency, how reputations are built on paperwork, not integrity. My evenings became quieter, my mornings sharper. I no longer entered through the back loading dock, but through the main doors, nodding to the receptionist, who now greeted me with cautious respect. It felt I would catch glimpses of him in the cafeteria or outside during smoke breaks he pretended were phone calls. He was thinner now, and there was a gray at his temples that had not been there before. Once, late in the day, I saw him sitting alone in a conference room, staring at a laptop that wasn't open. His reflection doubled in the glass wall behind him. I paused. But comfort given too soon is mercy wasted. I walked away. The work itself was meticulous and strangely soothing. I built charts, reconciled logs, mapped out storage discrepancies. My supervisor, no longer Ms. Patel, but a board liaison from the regional office, was efficient but respectful. And sometimes she would call me Mrs. Vargas, as if the formality could undo years of invisibility. I didn't correct her. The sound of it pleased me. My evenings were filled with the quiet hum of satisfaction, a rare companion in late age. I found myself humming while I cooked lentils, catching my reflection in the window with a half-smile I hadn't seen since my husband was alive. But progress always summons ghosts. One night, as I was leaving, I found a note slipped under my office door, a folded sheet of company stationery, unaddressed, unsigned. Inside was one line. I never meant for it to go this far. The handwriting was his. I read it 3 times, not to decipher it, but to let it settle. There was no apology, only a wish to rewrite the consequence. I tucked the note into my pocket without anger, the way one might pick up a dropped coin, not valuable, but recognizable. That night, I couldn't sleep. I sat by the window, the city lights trembling in the puddles below, and thought about how guilt is just love that has grown cowardly. The following morning, I brought the note with me and left it in a drawer of my new desk, under the stack of audit reports. I didn't respond, not because I wanted to punish him, but because silence was the only language that couldn't be misinterpreted. I understood now that I didn't need his remorse to validate my worth. That understanding was the real midpoint, the hidden turning inside me that changed everything. The story was no longer about what he had done to me, but about what I had stopped allowing him to do. As the weeks passed, I became something of a quiet curiosity among the staff. Some were kind, some patronizing, most cautious. But I noticed a subtle shift. People began to greet me not as the cleaner or the advisor, but simply as Mrs. Vargas. They started asking my opinion, small things at first, how to schedule deliveries to avoid waste, where to find the best contractors. They listened, and in those moments, I realized that power, when it finally comes to someone who never sought it, doesn't roar or demand attention. It hums quietly, steady and sure. I began to arrive early, sometimes before sunrise, just to walk through the empty corridors and feel the building wake around me. I would run my hand along the cool railings, touch the glass doors, check the thermostats, the small domestic rituals that once belonged to my nights, now reborn in daylight. It felt almost sacred, this caretaking. Perhaps it was. We speak often of careers and legacies, but not of stewardship, the humble act of leaving a place cleaner than we found it. That became my creed. One morning, as I stood by the panoramic window of the upper floor, watching the city spread beneath me like a map I had finally learned to read. I thought about my journey here, from the echoing corridors of invisibility to this quiet, sunlit clarity. I wasn't triumphant. Triumph is noisy. What I felt was gentler, like air filling a long, emptied lung. For the first time in years, I was living without waiting for someone else's approval to breathe. I pressed my palm against the glass, feeling the cold seep into my skin, and whispered softly to no one, "I see you now." That was the midpoint, the moment I turned from endurance to ownership, from surviving his dismissal to claiming my own presence. It didn't happen with fireworks or applause. It happened in the steady pulse of my heartbeat, in the echo of footsteps that were finally my own. And as I gathered my bag and walked toward the elevator, the light catching the polished floor beneath me, I understood that every corridor I had cleaned had led me here, to this exact clarity. I was not someone's mother tidying the mess he made. I was the keeper of a space he could never understand, and that, at last, was enough. The storm began quietly, as they often do in the polite corridors of corporate life, where confrontation is wrapped in email headers and stamped with words like urgent or clarification. It was a Tuesday, gray and wet, the kind of day that turns the city into a watercolor of itself. I arrived early, as I always did, my shoes squeaking faintly against the marble, and before I even reached my office, I sensed it. The shift in air, the glances that moved too quickly away, the low murmurs that travel faster than fact. When I opened my door, the note that had once rested in my drawer was gone. In its place lay a printed agenda for an emergency meeting, my name included among the attendees. I stared at it for a long time, tracing the letters with my fingertip, as if by doing so I could alter what they meant. The meeting was set for 11. Until then, the building carried its usual rhythm, the hum of computers, the sigh of elevators, the muted conversations about quarterly goals and client calls. But underneath it all ran a tension, a current strong enough to shift the light. When I finally walked into the boardroom, the air was thick with the scent of burnt coffee and anticipation. Ms. Patel was already there, her expression controlled, but watchful. Across from her sat the regional compliance officer, a man in a crisp navy suit who looked at everyone as if measuring their worth in silence. And there, at the far end of the table, was my son. He looked older, not in years but in spirit, the kind of aging that comes from nights without peace. His hair was uncombed, his tie loose, his eyes restless. For a moment I thought he might not recognize me, but of course he did. Recognition between a mother and son is not in the eyes. It is in the air between them, a shared pulse that never fully breaks. He didn't speak when I entered, didn't even nod. Ms. Patel gestured toward an empty chair beside her, and I sat, careful not to make the chair scrape against the floor. The compliance officer began speaking, his tone measured, professional, rehearsed. He explained that the internal audit had revealed significant irregularities in vendor contracts and that certain authorizations had bypassed standard oversight. His words were surgical, designed to cut without drawing visible blood. I listened, hands folded in my lap, the old instinct of silence returning like muscle memory. Then he began to read the names of those under review, and when he reached Evans, the room seemed to hold its breath. My son stared straight ahead, jaw clenched, the faint pulse at his temple beating like a warning. When the officer finished, Ms. Patel cleared her throat. "Before we proceed," she said, "I think it's important to note that these discrepancies were first identified by internal observation, by someone who noticed inconsistencies where others saw routine." Her gaze flicked toward me, quick, but unmistakable. A murmur rippled through the room. I felt the weight of a dozen eyes, curious, confused, some skeptical, some suddenly respectful. I wanted to disappear, to shrink back into the safe invisibility that had once been my shield. But that life no longer fit me. Evans spoke then, his voice low but steady. "So, what I'm saying," she replied, "is that integrity can appear in unexpected places." He gave a sharp laugh, short and bitter, then leaned back in his chair, arms crossed, eyes fixed on me. "Of course," he said softly. "Why didn't I see it sooner?" My mother, the corporate whistleblower. The word hung in the air like smoke, and I felt the old shame rise instinctively, that learned reaction to being mocked by the one person you once hoped would see you clearly. But then, just as quickly, it passed. I looked at him, not as my child, not as my failure, but as a man standing at the edge of his own consequences, and I felt nothing but calm. "I didn't blow a whistle," I said quietly. I opened a window. No one spoke after that for several seconds. The compliance officer coughed, shuffled his papers, and resumed talking about procedures and hearings and the timeline for disciplinary review. The rest of the meeting passed like a blur. When it ended, the participants left one by one, murmuring polite phrases, careful to avoid direct contact. Evan remained seated, staring at the folder in front of him, his fingers tracing the company logo. I waited. At last, he spoke, his voice smaller now, stripped of performance. "You've ruined me," he said. I almost laughed, not cruelly, but with the disbelief that comes when someone misreads the entire book of your life. "No," I said, "you did that yourself." "I just cleaned up after you, like always." He looked up then, and for the first time in years I saw the boy he had been, the boy who used to ask me if the moon followed our car at night, the boy who believed I could fix anything with my hands. He opened his mouth as if to speak again, but nothing came out. Instead, he gathered his papers roughly and left, the door closing behind him with the soft thud of something irreversible. In the days that followed, the investigation deepened. I wasn't involved officially, but word reached me in fragments. Meetings behind closed doors, documents reviewed, interviews conducted. The company, it turned out, had been bleeding money through fraudulent maintenance contracts signed under Evans' oversight. Contracts benefiting an outside firm run by an old friend of his, a man he owed favors to from his early career. It wasn't grand corruption, just the small, familiar kind, the type that grows from ego rather than greed, from the belief that rules are suggestions meant for smaller people. The irony was sharp. He had mocked me for my humility, yet it was his arrogance that had cost him everything. I carried on with my work quietly, answering questions when asked, keeping my head level. Some co-workers treated me with awe, others with discomfort, as if they weren't sure whether to thank me or fear what else I might notice. Ms. Patel remained kind but distant. Perhaps she understood that gratitude, like guilt, can easily turn sour. Then came the confrontation I had not expected, not in the office, but at home. It was late, near midnight. Rain tapped against my window in thin, persistent fingers. I had just finished my tea when the doorbell rang. For a long moment, I didn't move. Visitors at that hour rarely bring peace. When I opened the door, he stood there, soaked, his eyes red from drink or tears or both. He didn't ask to come in. He simply stepped forward as if his presence were a right. I didn't stop him. He dropped into the chair by the window, the same one where I often sat to watch the city lights, and ran his hands over his face. "I lost everything," he said finally. "They're suspending me. Patel says I can resign quietly or face a formal inquiry. Do you know what that means? Do you know what you've done?" His voice cracked at the edges. I didn't answer immediately. I poured him tea instead, though he didn't touch it. "Evan," I said, "what I did was what you taught me to do without knowing it. You wanted to be admired, but I wanted to be decent. There's a difference." He looked up sharply. "You think you're better than me?" he asked. I shook my head. "No. I think I stopped being less." He stood then, pacing, his anger folding over itself, too exhausted to ignite. "You've humiliated me," he said again. "Do you understand what people will think? That my own mother turned against me?" I wanted to tell him that I hadn't turned against him, but toward the truth, that the two directions are often confused by those who've lived too long in comfort. But I could see he wasn't ready to hear that. So instead, I said nothing. Silence is the last dignity of the wounded. He left without saying goodbye, the door slamming in a final punctuation mark. I sat there for a long while, listening to the rain, the sound of it steady and indifferent. I felt sorrow, yes, but not regret. The ache in my chest was not grief, but release. For the first time in decades, I was not carrying the burden of his image, not smoothing his rough edges to make him lovable to the world. He would have to face himself now, stripped of the applause that had always drowned out accountability. The next morning, I returned to the office. There was a meeting scheduled, though not for me this time. As I walked past the boardroom, I caught sight of him through the glass walls, no longer seated at the table but standing before it, handing in his resignation letter. Ms. Patel nodded once, businesslike, and reached out her hand. He didn't take it. I moved on, not lingering, not gloating. The janitor's instinct, after all, is to leave no trace. By the end of the week, his office was cleared, the nameplate removed, the desk empty. I was asked to oversee the turnover, to ensure proper documentation of assets. It was, perhaps, the cruelest form of symmetry, the mother cleaning out her son's workspace. I did it. When I reached the last drawer, I found a photograph, a small one of him as a child standing beside me in front of our old apartment. His arm around my waist, his grin missing 2 front teeth. I held it for a moment, tracing the edges, then placed it gently in the top box. Some things do not need to be discarded. They simply need to rest. As I left the building that evening, the city bathed in the orange light of sunset. I felt a strange mixture of peace and fatigue. Justice, I realized, is not clean work. It leaves residue, fine as dust, that settles quietly into the corners of your conscience. You can't sweep it away. You just learn to live among it, to breathe through it, to let it remind you that truth always costs something, even when it sets you free. That night, as I prepared for bed, I looked at my reflection in the bathroom mirror. The line I thought, because the real cleansing I understood now was never of floors or contracts, but of the stories we tell ourselves to survive. And mine, at last, was spotless. The announcement came 3 weeks after his resignation, on a day that began with the soft gray light of late winter and the sound of rain sliding down the building's glass like time made visible. I was sitting at my small desk sorting through a set of maintenance schedules when Ms. Patel appeared at my door holding a folder thick enough to mean permanence. She smiled, the kind of smile that carries both relief and quiet satisfaction, and said, "The board approved it. They want you to stay, officially." For a heartbeat, I didn't understand what she meant. I had grown used to the temporary nature of my position, to the idea that I was a bridge between what was broken and what could be repaired. She placed the folder in front of me and added, "Facilities Director, full-time, with staff. You've done more to stabilize this building in 3 months than most people do in years." I looked down at the papers, my name printed neatly at the top, the salary, the responsibilities, and felt the strangest mixture of disbelief and calm. Not triumph, not even joy, but an awareness that something had come full circle in a way too symmetrical to be coincidence. I thought of all the years I had scrubbed floors and emptied bins while others drafted policies and budgets, and now those same tasks were written into a job description that would pay me more than I had ever earned. It wasn't the money that moved me, it was the acknowledgement, the simple, clean recognition of competence. I signed without ceremony, the pen steady in my hand, and when I looked up, Ms. Patel was watching me closely, as if she too understood that the moment didn't need applause. That afternoon, she asked if I would attend a small departmental meeting, something about new procedures and public recognition. I agreed, though I dislike gatherings that pretend to be casual. The meeting was held in the same glass conference room where months before I had sat silently while my son's name was read aloud like a verdict. This time, the air felt different, lighter, as though the building itself had exhaled after holding its breath too long. People filled the seats, employees from every level, from accountants to janitors. And when Ms. Patel stood to speak, her voice carried the kind of warmth that comes from sincerity, not performance. She spoke about transparency, about rebuilding trust within the company, about honoring the workers who kept the foundations solid when the upper floors had started to crack. And then she called my name. The sound of it startled me. I stood slowly, unsure where to look. Applause began softly, and then grew, hesitant at first, then sure, filling the room in waves. I didn't know what to do with my hands, so I simply folded them before me. Ms. Patel gestured for me to come forward, and when I did, she handed me a small plaque. Nothing grand, just a rectangle of glass etched with my name and the words, "For restoring integrity." There it was, the full reversal of the scene that had begun my descent into humiliation. Months ago, I had been the invisible worker, overhearing my son's mockery at the elevator, my presence something to be hidden, a reflection too raw for his ambition. Now I stood at the front of the same building, visible and unashamed, surrounded by colleagues who looked at me with genuine respect. But the strangest thing was that I felt no vengeance, no desire to relish my vindication. The room blurred slightly, the applause blending into a single sustained note, and all I could think was how quiet it suddenly was inside my heart. After the meeting, as people came up to shake my hand, one of them, a young woman from accounting, barely older than my son when he first left home, said softly, "My mother cleans offices too. She'd want me to thank you." That sentence touched me more deeply than any official recognition could. It was proof that dignity, once reclaimed, multiplies. I left the building early that day, stepping out into the thin drizzle, the plaque wrapped in my coat pocket. The city was alive with its usual contradictions. Taxis honking in the rain, steam rising from vents, people moving briskly through their separate worlds. I walked without purpose, letting the streets lead me. Every block seemed to hold an echo of the life I had lived. Here, the coffee shop where I once sat waiting for Evan after his job interview. There, the thrift store where I bought the jacket I wore the night of the company party. Memory folded over itself until the city felt like a palimpsest of my own endurance. I reached the river and stood for a long time beneath the bridge, watching the water carry away the color of the sky. The plaque felt heavy in my pocket, but it was a pleasant weight, like proof that labor, even the most humble, leaves a trace. When I returned home, the answering machine light blinked. I pressed play without hope. His voice filled the room, softer than I remembered, cautious, stripped of its usual certainty. "Hi, Mom," he began, pausing before the word, as if testing whether it still belonged to him. "I heard about your promotion. Patel called me. She said you deserve it." He drew a breath, the kind that carries a century of unsaid things. "I'm sorry," he continued, the words halting, unfamiliar. "Not just for the office, for the way I treated you. I thought success was something you wore, not something you earned. I was wrong." Another pause, longer this time. "If you don't want to talk, I'll understand. I just wanted you to know I'm proud of you. Really proud." The message ended with the faint click of disconnection, but it lingered in the air like a scent. I stood there, hand still on the machine, unsure whether to cry or smile. Pride, I thought, was such a strange inheritance. I had spent years swallowing it so he could grow his, and now, when it finally returned to me, it didn't taste bitter at all. It was quiet, almost tender, like a gift I'd left for myself and forgotten. That night then I imagined him now, older, humbled, still learning how to be human. Maybe that was the real inheritance, the slow education of the soul that comes when illusions finally crumble. Later that week, the company hosted a small reception for the staff. I went, not because I liked such events, but because absence can sometimes be misread as shame. The room was filled with laughter and polite conversation, the sound of glasses clinking against the low hum of music. Ms. Patel gave a brief speech, nothing grand, and then invited me to say a few words. I hesitated, then stepped forward. My hands did not tremble. I looked around the room, at the young interns pretending to be older than they were, at the older executives pretending not to be afraid of irrelevance, at the cleaners and clerks who lingered near the back, unsure whether they belonged. "Clean work," I said finally, "always shows. Dirty work always reveals itself." The sentence came out softer than I intended, but it settled into the room like dust finding its rightful place. No one applauded at first. They simply nodded, a silent acknowledgement of truth. Then, slowly, the clapping began, gentle and sustained. When I left the party, the air outside was cool and fragrant, the rain finally gone. I walked home under the streetlights, their glow blurring at the edges. The sidewalks were still wet, shining like mirrors, and in each reflection I saw not the janitor, not the consultant, not even the director, but the woman who had carried all those roles without breaking. For years, I had mistaken endurance for weakness, service for smallness. But standing there, under the quiet shimmer of the city. I understood that strength is not what keeps you upright. It's what keeps you kind after everything. At home, I opened the window to let in the night air. The city murmured softly, its noise distant and familiar. I thought of calling him back, of saying something gentle and brief. But then I decided not to. Some apologies are best left to ripen in silence, where they can grow into understanding instead of another transaction. I turned off the lights and let the darkness settle around me. For the first time in a long time, I felt no weight pressing on my chest, no invisible audience waiting for me to fail. The room was still, the air clean, the kind of clean that doesn't come from effort, but from release. As I lay down, I realized the real climax had not been in that boardroom, nor in the applause or the promotion, but in this quiet moment of stillness where I no longer needed to prove anything, not to him, not to them, not even to myself. I had reclaimed my story the way a gardener reclaims a neglected plot, patiently, layer by layer, until something living begins to bloom again. The night outside was deep and calm, and in its vastness I felt small, but not diminished. I closed my eyes and whispered to the dark, "It's done." And for once, the word didn't mean ending. It meant arrival. Spring arrived without ceremony, the kind of quiet rebirth that unfolds unnoticed until one morning the light through the window feels warmer, and the air carries the faint sweetness of wet earth instead of salt and exhaust. The building across the street was draped in scaffolding, workers shouting cheerfully as they painted over the grime of another winter, and I found myself smiling at the sound. It reminded me of the steady rhythm of mops and buckets, of all the invisible music that builds the world while others sleep. By then, I had settled fully into my new position, the rhythm of responsibility fitting around me like a well-worn coat. The office no longer felt like an adversary. It was a living thing that I understood from the inside out, and tending to it gave me the same peace I used to find in polishing floors. Order had always been my language, and now I could finally speak it aloud. Yet even as stability returned, a different kind of restlessness began to hum beneath it. A question about what comes after survival, after vindication, after the noise of being seen fades into the stillness of being known. I didn't hear from Evan again for several weeks after his message. At first, I assumed that was the end of it, that he had said what he needed to and retreated into the privacy of his regret. I had learned not to expect closure from other people. It rarely arrives in the shape we hope for. But one Sunday morning, as I was returning from the market with a bag of lemons and fresh bread, I saw him standing outside my building. He looked thinner, paler, dressed not in his usual armor of pressed suits, but in jeans and a simple jacket that made him look younger and strangely vulnerable. For a moment we just stood there, two silhouettes in the mild sunlight, the silence between us filled with all the years we had misused. Then he spoke. "I wasn't sure you'd want to see me," he said. His voice was quiet, uncertain. "I wasn't sure either," I replied, and something in my tone must have startled him because he smiled. Not the confident smile of a man used to winning, but the small, careful smile of someone asking permission to begin again. We walked up to my apartment, and I made tea without speaking. He looked around the room as if seeing it for the first time, the small plants on the windowsill, the photographs of people he barely knew anymore. When we finally sat, he took a deep breath. "I've been working at a nonprofit," he said, eyes fixed on his cup. "Community housing projects. They needed someone with operations experience. It's different." I waited. I thought I was done. he continued. After everything, I thought no one would hire me. But one of the board members said they admired how I handled the fallout, that I took responsibility. He gave a short, self-conscious laugh. Funny, isn't it? I didn't for not hating me. I sipped my tea before answering. Hatred is heavy, Evan. I carried enough of your things already. He stayed for an hour, maybe two. We talked about ordinary things. The rising cost of groceries, the new metro line, a movie he'd seen that he said I'd like. It felt strange, almost domestic, and yet fragile, like walking on thin ice that might hold or might not. When he left, he hugged me awkwardly, as if unsure whether he was allowed. His coat smelled faintly of rain and coffee. At the door, he turned and said, "I'm trying to be someone you could respect." I wanted to tell him he didn't need to earn my respect anymore, that it was his own he needed to find. But I only said, "Keep trying." After he left, I stood by the window, watching him disappear down the street, the wind tugging at his jacket. It struck me then how much of motherhood is learning to let your child become a stranger and still wish him well. In the weeks that followed, life unfolded with a quiet steadiness I had never known before. Work was busy, but not frantic. I mentored younger staff, taught them how to see problems before they grew, how to notice the details that others overlook. Some evenings, I stayed late just to walk through the silent corridors, feeling the hum of the building settling for the night. The reflection of the ceiling lights and the polished floors made it look as if the ground held its own constellations, small stars I had coaxed into being with patience and cloth. I thought about how every act of care, no matter how small, leaves a trace. Cleanliness, like truth, is cumulative. One evening, as I was locking up, I found a folded note taped to my office door. The handwriting was familiar. Evans. It read, "They offered me a permanent position. I start next month. I wanted you to be the first to know." Below it, he had drawn a small, uneven circle, the same doodle he used to make on his school papers when he was a child, a sun with short, blunt rays. I smiled and slipped the note into my pocket. It felt like the end of a long sentence that had finally found its period. Now, when I walk to work in the mornings, I see the city differently. The streets I once crossed with my head down feel open, generous. The faces of cleaners and delivery drivers, of cashiers and bus operators seem brighter to me. Not because they've changed, but because I finally understand that every one of them is a witness to the quiet labor that keeps the world from collapsing. I no longer rush past them. I nod, sometimes exchange a word, sometimes just meet their gaze long enough for recognition to pass between us. Respect, I've learned, doesn't need to be spoken. It only needs to be seen. At home, I've kept the plaque in the same place on the kitchen shelf, beside a small framed photograph of my mother holding a broom outside her old cafe. She used to tell me that dignity was like soap. You lose it if you stop using it. I didn't understand then, but now I do. Each day still brings its mess, its minor cruelties, its small acts of forgetting. But I face them with a steadiness that feels like grace. I no longer wish to be invisible, but neither do I crave attention. Visibility, I discovered, is just another kind of work, and like all work, it demands balance. Sometimes, late at night, when the city quiets and the hum of the refrigerator becomes the only sound, I think about the arc of my life, the years of silence, the moment of breaking, the slow rebuilding. I don't romanticize any of it. Pain doesn't need poetry. It already knows its lines. But I am grateful, in a calm, unshowy way, for having lived long enough to see the story bend toward peace. I have learned that forgiveness is not a gift you give the one who hurt you. It's the key that unlocks your own breath. Before going to bed, I write small notes on scraps of paper, reminders to myself, truths I don't want to forget. I tape them inside the cabinet where I keep the cleaning supplies. Respect is quiet. Work is prayer. Love does not erase pain, it redefines it. These little fragments keep me company, like a conversation with the woman I used to be. One of the notes written in a moment of clarity after my last meeting with Evan says, "What you clean is never just dirt." Each time I see it, I smile. On my final night before retirement, years later, I will take down that note and leave another in its place. I already know what it will say, though the ink has not yet touched the paper. To the woman who comes after me, walk proudly. The ground beneath you remembers every hand that made it shine. And I will lock the door one last time, the sound echoing softly in the empty hallway, and step out into the world that once tried to make me small, carrying nothing but lightness in my chest and the quiet certainty that I have, at last, become whole.